All right, welcome everybody. I've got 4 o'clock, so we'll kick things off. My name is Greg Stiegel. I am the operations director for Renewable Energy Alaska Project. And we've got a great event here today. This is our second to last speaker series of the season. So thank you all for joining us. I'm just gonna click through a few slides here. First, I'd like to just acknowledge the lands we are on. I'm actually zooming in from my parents' house in Massachusetts today, which is on the traditional lands of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people. REAP staff live and work throughout the entire state of Alaska, and we recognize the thousands of years that Native Alaskans have been stewards of our lands. I'd like to encourage everybody to use the chat function and introduce yourselves. The chat feature sometimes auto goes to just the panelists and hosts. So make sure you select everybody that you're sending your chat to and let us know which native lands you're coming from. If you're unsure, you can follow the link on this slide here, native-land.ca, and you'll be able to identify which land you're on. While people are introducing themselves, I'll just go over a couple nuts and bolts of today's presentation. We've got a quick hour here, so we're going to try to get through a lot. We are going to have 2 presentations from our presenters, and then we'll save a good chunk of time at the end for Q&A. We will be collecting question and answers in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, not the chat. So please be sure to use that if you have any questions. Our panelists might answer some live if they're quick answers, and then we'll save some for the end. So as questions pop up, feel free to use the Q&A. You're welcome to continue to use the chat throughout the presentations if you want to share links or have any conversations, but do use the Q&A for questions so we can keep track of those. We're also recording this webinar. I will be sending out a follow-up email with the link to this recording. So if you want to share this with anybody after the event, you're welcome to do so. Now, for those of you who've been here before, you are probably aware of who REAP is, but for any newcomers, I'll just do a quick introduction on who we are here at Renewable Energy Alaska Project. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have a coalition of about 70 members. We also work with partners around the state and country, such as National Renewable Energy Lab, and we have donors as well. Our mission, broadly speaking, is to increase clean energy throughout the state of Alaska. We often talk about our work in this framework of 4 different pillars here, technology being the one area that we don't work directly in. We try to translate technology for people. That's part of what we're doing today, is talking about technology for geothermal, and we're going to have some experts come in and give us some insight there. Most of our staff, the biggest chunk of our staff actually is working in K through 12 STEM education, and that's teaching lessons through the lens of clean energy in K through 12 classrooms. We also do teacher trainings. We've got a variety of partnerships around the state and nation, one with NREL, the Energy Transition Initiative Partnership Project. That works in technical assistance and energy planning in rural Alaska. We also have the Alaska Network for Energy Education and Employment, working on workforce development and connecting clean energy pathways from K through 12 education through universities and jobs. And another program that we work with is the Sustainable Southeast Partnership, and that is a holistic, community-oriented partnership that in Southeast Alaska, on our last speaker series of the event of the season coming up in 2 weeks, is going to be focusing on that. We also have a variety of policy initiatives that we're working on. We have 2 pieces of legislation in the state legislature right now, one to establish a green bank for the state, and another to create a renewable portfolio standard for the state. Here's just a quick slide of our last speaker series of the season, coming up in 2 weeks from today, talking about the Sustainable Southeast Partnership. So be sure to sign up for this. To hear more, I will send a link out in follow-up email with signups for that as well. And with that, I will jump into today's presentation. I'll just go ahead and intro both of our speakers today and then let them take it away. So first we have Caity Smith. She has over 15 years of experience in the geothermal industry. She began her career focused on drilling and project management in the United States before transitioning to work in East Africa on capacity building and community engagement projects. Caity joined NREL in 2019 and manages multiple geothermal competitions and prizes for DOE's Geothermal Technologies Office, as well as leading stakeholder engagement and geothermal education and capacity building programs. Caity's passionate about empowering women in the geothermal sector and mentors young professionals through the U.S. Department of State Female Leaders in Energy program, as well as serving as the co-leader for Women in Geothermal's Future Leaders cohort. And following Caity will be Amanda Kolker. Amanda is the laboratory program manager for geothermal at NREL. She also has 15 years of professional experience as a geothermal geologist, specializing in resource exploration and sustainable production of geothermal energy. With a background in volcanology and geochemistry, Amanda has worked in academia, government, and private industry in the United States and abroad. She values multidisciplinary and innovative approaches to the energy questions and enjoys working at the intersections of geoscience, policy, and economics. So I think I will leave it there and stop sharing my screen. And thank you, Caity and Amanda, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg, for having us here today and for that warm welcome. Amanda and I are both joining the group from Golden, Colorado, where we both live and work on Ute and Cheyenne lands. So we're here today to talk to you about the possibilities of geothermal energy in Alaska. So some of the things we're going to go over today are a general overview of geothermal technologies, Alaska's geothermal resources, some various case studies of geothermal development that is already underway in Alaska, and then some discussion about opportunities and challenges for geothermal energy in Alaska. We will be doing Q&A at the end of this session, as Greg said. However, because Amanda and I are tag teaming this, feel free to drop questions in at any point and we will answer them if possible. So we're really here today to talk to you about why geothermal energy. Geothermal is a baseload renewable energy source for both heat and power. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about geothermal, as well as other renewable energy resources, is capacity factor. For those of you who are maybe new to the energy scene, capacity factor is defined as the average consumption, output, or throughput over a period of time of a particular technology or piece of infrastructure, divided by its full capacity that it's rated at. So basically, it's how often or what percent of the time you are actually producing energy or heat from your system. And so there's quite a few different things that can affect capacity factors, such as downtime of a plant for maintenance or availability of the fuel source, such as wind or sun. So geothermal does have the highest capacity factor of any of the renewable energy sources. Generally, we say that geothermal has around a 90% capacity factor, which means that it's producing energy 90% of the time, compared to wind, which has a lower 45% capacity factor, and solar photovoltaic of 20%. Geothermal also has the smallest footprint and land use of any geothermal or any renewable energy technology. A traditional geothermal field takes up about the size of 2 football fields plus the power plant. Another great thing about geothermal is that we rarely decommission power plants that are based on geothermal in the US. The first geothermal power plant in the world is in Laterello, Italy, and it's been operating for over 100 years. Often when we're talking about geothermal on an electricity scale, we predict that the plants will last 20 to 30 years. However, here in the US, we have plants that have been operating for close to 50 years. We say the same about heat systems used for geothermal. However, here in Boise and Idaho, there's a geothermal district heating system that has been operating for almost 130 years now. And there was one in France that ran for several centuries. So exciting, long life possibility. So I am going to go over some of the different geothermal technologies today. So geothermal does fall into 3 distinct classes. These classes are generally based on the approximate temperature of the geothermal resource that's being used, and they indicate the type of applications that can be achieved. So of these, we have geo-exchange or geothermal heat pumps, which you don't really need a whole lot of a resource for. And these are things that you would use for heating or cooling of buildings and homes. There's direct use of geothermal heat, which you need more of a mid-range resource for. Amanda and I generally talk in Celsius, so we usually look at 30 to 150 C, but that's also about 86 to 300 F for those of you who don't care for the Celsius scale. And then we have geothermal electricity, which is for those reservoir temperatures over 300 F. So I'm going to go into each of the technologies. So as I said, first of all, there's the geothermal heat pumps or geo-exchange technologies. This uses energy from the ground to supply a portion of heat to the building. Some of that heat does come from electricity to run the heat pump. And in Alaska, about 2/3 of the heat is from the ground and 1/3 is from electricity. There are a few different versions of heat pumps. This open loop one does not work well in cold climates. So this is not a great option in Alaska. However, these closed loop vertical and horizontal wells, as well as these closed loop underwater, work great in Alaska. So a heat pump is basically technology that takes the consistent temperature underground, anywhere from 4 to 10 feet deep, and uses that to bring the warmer water temperatures into your home. There are 2 different types of geothermal heat pumps. We have the slinky loops, which are shallower, so you don't actually have to bring in a drilling rig to drill wells for those. Those are installed in trenches. However, you need to have a pretty large area to lay all of those loops. We also have the wells option, which have a smaller surface footprint. However, these wells need to be drilled to about 200 feet deep, and they are a closed loop system. So all of these well technologies do happen with underground. The slinky loop systems can be either underground or they can be put in bodies of water. So the next part of geothermal that we're going to talk about is geothermal direct use technologies. So direct use includes a wide range of technologies, including heating, agricultural, and industrial applications. And then this graphic that we have here on the screen shows an example of cascaded use of geothermal. Cascaded uses of geothermal is great where you have reservoir temperatures that are a bit higher. So you can start by, if you have this higher temperature, you can actually produce electricity. And then as the temperatures decrease, as you go through the electricity production process, you can use that residual heat for additional uses, such as a modular geothermal desalination unit, food dehydrator, greenhouses, aquaculture, etc. There are cases where geothermal direct use is used for soil warming, timber drying, cooking and pasteurization, pulp and paper processing, aquaculture, and greenhousing. In Iceland, in Reykjavik, they actually have direct use geothermal that they have running under their roads, which melts the snow and ice so that they don't have to be plowing on a regular basis. We do also have district heating technologies. So district heating technology, this is an example of the largest district heating system in Europe. And these technologies can be either heating only or include cooling as well. These can have those smaller or slightly lower temperatures. The direct use does fall in that mid category, so above about 30 degrees C. And then here you can see in this photo, there is a reservoir here where they've drilled various wells and are bringing that heat to the surface and then piping it throughout the area to various buildings. So that last slide showed you about the district heating system in Paris. However, we did want to give you a look at the various district heating systems within the US. So district energy is a centralized production of heating and cooling and domestic hot water. There can also be power created in these systems, but not always. These district energy systems do optimize cost, efficiency, and local resources. And currently, renewable district energy is key to decarbonizing heating and cooling within Europe and Asia. So you can see on the map on the right that there are a pretty wide variety of district heating systems that are used throughout the United States. They're used at different places, such as airports, colleges and universities, commercial buildings, cities, healthcare, industrial, homes, etc. And then on the right, we show the left, we show the potential increase of district heating installations from 23, which is what we currently have in the US, to 17,500 installations nationwide, as was predicted in the Department of Energy's GeoVision report, which came out in 2019. So geothermal direct use in the US is currently focused on district heating. There are 23 different systems in the Western states. Most were installed in the 1980s. There are geothermal heat pump based geothermal district heating and cooling systems in Denver, Houston, New York, and Pennsylvania. And you can see on here that we have lower numbers. Some of these systems that are in use in the US are quite old. So 26% of the systems are over 40 years old, with 56% in the 30 to 40 year range. So the oldest, as I said earlier, is 129 years old, and that's in Boise, Idaho. The last form of geothermal technology is geothermal electricity. So we're going to talk a bit today about both hydrothermal and petrothermal resources. Amanda will go into the differences between those a lot more in a few slides, but a hydrothermal resource is your traditional geothermal system that most people know about. It is a water-based resource that occurs in a naturally occurring fracture network. So basically, you just need to drill into the ground where you think there's a resource and find those fractures, as well as the hot water and steam. So there are three different types of power generation for geothermal. The first and oldest is on the far left. That's the dry steam power plants. The first dry steam power plant was in Italy in 1906. And for these power plants, the dry steam only works in areas where the reservoir is purely steam and there's no water that's coming up. So geothermal reservoirs can be either hot water, they can be purely steam, or they can be a mix of the two. And depending on what the composition of the reservoir is, that will determine what technology you use to produce power. So for the dry steam power plant, as I said, that was the first type of power plant that was ever used for geothermal energy. They are fairly rare though, because those dry steam dry steam reservoirs aren't very common. So there's one in Italy, the geysers in California is a dry steam reservoir, and there are a few different systems in Japan that are also dry steam. The second technology is the flash steam power plants. And on these go in a hot water-based reservoir. And so on those, you can do the flash steam with a slightly lower temperature resource because you're bringing up that hot water. So it's brought to the surface under pressure, where it's then flashed into steam in a tank at the surface. So here's your flash tank. And then from there, the steam goes through the turbine to create energy, and the condensate and hot water are re-injected back into the reservoir. And then the most recent technology that's used in geothermal power plants is the binary cycle. So this is similar to the flash steam plants. However, there's this extra step of this heat exchanger with working fluids. So the hot water comes out of the ground and it goes into the heat exchanger where there's a working fluid that has a lower boiling point than water. So the hot water keeps that fluid, which then creates the steam, which we then run through the turbine. The great thing about this binary cycle power plant is that it is a completely closed loop system. So there are some emissions that are occasionally associated with geothermal plants around CO2 or H2S. So you do sometimes get those emissions with the flash steam or the dry power plants. But with the binary cycle power plants, because there is no exposure to the air, all of those chemicals go directly back down into the reservoir. One thing that we do want to note is that many people have a perception that using geothermal for power or even heat could impact the surface manifestations, such as hot springs and fumaroles. And if geothermal is done well and planned properly, that's not a concern. So petrothermal resources are resources where there's really hot rock, but not necessarily that fracture network or the hot water. So these are more emerging technologies that are being tested in the US as well as in Europe. The main source shown on the left is EGS, or enhanced geothermal systems. And in those systems, wells are drilled, and then the rock formation is stimulated. So there's a couple different ways of doing that. Most often for geothermal, we use cold water, which is injected into the wells, and the thermal contractions caused by putting the cold water into the hot rock create a fracture network. And then you've got both your water and your fractures, so which can then heat the water, which you can then bring that either that hot water or steam to the surface. There's also chemical stimulation. If there's a naturally occurring fracture that are maybe plugged with mineral buildup, those chemicals can be used to dissolve or remove that buildup to access the fractures. The other option is, under these emerging technologies, is this advanced geothermal system. This uses a closed loop technology. So basically they go in and they drill a bunch of horizontal wells that are all connected to each other. So it's basically like a horizontal radiator under the ground. And then they would run the working fluid through those wells, and the thermal conductivity of the rock surrounding the pipes and the casing would heat that, which would then run the power plant. There are also some re-emerging technologies around co-production. And And actually about 20 minutes ago, before this presentation, Amanda and I both received an email from the Department of Energy's Geothermal Technologies office talking about some of these. So I think Amanda's going to go ahead and drop the link to that article in the chat if anyone's more introduced or interested in finding more information on that. So co-production of hot water and oil and gas has been getting a lot of recognition lately and a lot of interest from the geothermal industry. So often when you're drilling for oil and gas wells, there's a large amount of hot water that's produced in addition to those hydrocarbons. This is generally called the water cut. So what percentage of what comes out of the well is water versus either your oil or your natural gas. And this is not pure water. This is water that has chemicals and all sorts of interesting stuff in it. So it's really inconvenient and expensive for the oil and gas companies to dispose of it. There has been people looking at cycle technology that allows this co-produced hot water from the oil and gas wells to be converted into electricity at the site. These types of reservoir or this type of production isn't necessarily going to power an entire town, but it could definitely create local energy locally for the man camp around the rig site, the rigs themselves, or a small surrounding area. So it would also help to reduce emissions, save on energy, and extend the economic life of these oil and gas wells. There's also research being done looking into repurposing oil and gas wells that are no longer producing hydrocarbons, but looking at using them for hot water instead. So I think I'm now going to pass the presentation over to Amanda, and she's going to talk a little bit about Alaska's geothermal resources.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, Katie. And thank you to Greg and to Reap for that warm introduction. Happy to be here talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is the geothermal resource potential in Alaska. So this slide just shows sort of a reminder of what Katie had mentioned before, which is that there's really a number of different technologies associated with geothermal energy and applications. And the types of resources you need for those different technologies and applications varies. So going sort of from the highest temperature applications on the top, at the top of the thermometer here, we've got power generation technologies, and those really do need to be run off of mid to high temperature resources, which globally are geographically rare. The good thing about high temperature resources is that they often are associated with some kind of surface expression, like Katie said, hot springs or fumaroles, which are steam vents, typically on volcanoes. So they are in some ways a little easier to find than lower temperature resources, which tend to stay hidden, but they're more rare. And so those resources, as Katie mentioned, can be used for not just electricity production, but direct use as well. And so when you go down the thermometer, then you start getting into the applications related to direct use. So you can do things like industrial processes around, a few examples are given here of cement drying and pulp and paper processing, lumber drying. Some of the agriculture applications that are powered by geothermal heat include food processing, greenhouses, and fish farming or aquaculture. And then as you go down to the point where really you're not in any kind of anomalous geothermal resource, then you get into the realm of geothermal heat pumps, as Katie mentioned. Next slide. And Katie mentioned also the difference between hydrothermal or hot water resources and petrothermal resources, which are hot rock. Almost all of the worldwide power production and direct use uses hydrothermal or hot water type resources. But in order to get those types of resources, you need a kind of specific geologic setting. You need abundant heat found in rocks in depth. And that's easy, that Earth does that everywhere. But then you also need not only fluid to carry the heat from the rocks, but you also need small pathways, typically faults or fractures, sometimes impermeable strata, to conduct the fluid through the hot rocks. And those two latter elements are what's rarer. So although heat exists everywhere below us, often the fluid or pathways aren't sufficient to carry this heat to the surface for us to use for power or for heat. So petrothermal resources kind of are a emerging type of resource that we'd like to be able to use for heat. And we are using a bit for power using new technologies such as EGS and closed loop or AGS that Caity referred to earlier. In principle, petrothermal or hot rock is ubiquitous. Although I will say that, the thermal gradient of the Earth or how hot it gets with depth is variable. So, some of these petrothermal resources you have to drill multiple kilometers or even miles to get to, and then some of them are close to the surface depending on the geology. Next slide. So in 2019, the Alaska Energy Authority and the Renewable Energy Alaska project came out with the Renewable Energy Atlas of Alaska, or an updated one, I should say. And that shows the geothermal resources map of Alaska, which is really a hydrothermal resources map. It's hot water resources that we know of, broken into wells and springs by temperature, and also showing Alaska's volcanoes. And so there are really three distinct hydrothermal or hot water regimes in Alaska. The first one I know a whole lot about because I spent 5 years studying it up at UAF. That was my dissertation topic. So that's the Central Alaska Hot Spring Belt, and it goes all the way, actually, we're just showing the Alaska part of this, but it actually goes into the Yukon Territory of Canada. And it stretches all the way from Nome to out past China to the east. And it contains about 30 hot springs. Oops. Then, okay, I think Caity wants me to move faster. The next hydrothermal regime is the Ring of Fire volcanoes. And so, as you can see by the size of the dots there, the Alaska Hot Springs Belt that I mentioned before has sort of lower grade, mid-grade resources, whereas the Ring of Fire volcanoes tend to have hotter, larger, more voluminous geothermal or hydrothermal systems. And then the last distinct hydrothermal regime are the Southeast Hot Springs. Now, these are all pretty distinct geologic settings. And I will say that, very little is known about points between these places, whether there's a resource between, say, Chena and Manly is unknown. So next slide. So there's kind of two ways of looking at geothermal resources, like we've been kind of alluding to. One is to look for hydrothermal, which is shown on the map on the left, and that this comes from the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys, and it shows pretty much the same thing I showed before of discrete and isolated hot springs or wells connected to a hydrothermal resource, and that those really cannot be extrapolated very well because they're pretty localized phenomena. Whereas the other way of looking at geothermal resources is to look at petrothermal. So, like we mentioned, hot, dry rock resources, or basically, just more generally looking at heat flow and how hot the Earth gets with depth. And that's what's shown on the right. And this is a map from 2015. And it, again, does not show anything about fluid. And it shows actually a little bit about pathways if you're looking at those black lines, which are faults. And what I would like to point out is that Alaska has a very sort of anomalously high heat flow regime, but there are some limitations with extrapolating those data from point to point. This entire state map is based on very few data points, but in general, you can see that the general heat flow regime in Alaska is pretty anomalous if you compare it to other heat flow maps of both the US and the world. Next slide. So this is what I was alluding to is, one of the challenges in Alaska is we really don't have very many data points for subsurface heat flow. Most of the data points are oil and gas wells and getting the bottom hole temperatures from oil and gas wells. And the map on the right shows the data sources for the map on the left. And what I'd like to point out is that, for example, the green squares, which are some new data points that were used to make the 2015 map, you can see there's really some concentration of those new data points, say on the western part of the Kenai Peninsula and in South Central in general, and then also offshore on the North Slope. But you know, most of Alaska really has no data. And so there's a lot of extrapolations involved. Nonetheless, next slide. Sorry, I was thinking I had another slide, but you know, in general, the Alaska really does have a good hydrothermal and potentially petrothermal resource base with respect to a lot of other countries and states. So I wanted to zoom in on the rail belt resources for this audience. This shows a map that was put together by NREL really recently as part of the rail belt renewable portfolio study. And you know, the thing I wanted to point out about this map is that compared to the wind and the solar data sets, the geothermal data set was pretty poor because of all of those reasons I mentioned earlier. And most of what this map shows is actually exclusions like national parks and terrain exclusions. But we do see that west of the Cook Inlet, you know, there is the big Mount Spur potential geothermal resource that could be used for power production to the rail belt. And then there's also these sort of orange areas that are, you know, lower grade resources that might be able to produce power but need to be explored further, kind of at this microgrid scale, you know, of less than a megawatt or so. In general, you know, the Kenai Peninsula does not have high potential for power producing resources, and neither does most of the rail belt. The northern rail belt, you know, could have some of these smaller scale power generation resources, kind of like China, but it's unlikely for those to be within 50 miles of the grid itself. So those are all of the the orange area is probably better suited for heating applications, like what Caity discussed earlier. Next slide. We wanted to share with you a few case studies or, you know, snapshots of geothermal projects in Alaska. So Chena Hot Springs has the only geothermal power plant in the entire state, which is interesting because it's a pretty, you know, low temperature resource. In fact, it's the lowest temperature resource to be produced for power in the world. But they don't only produce power. The single resource goes first to the power plant, but then is cascaded to lots of different uses like chilling via an absorption chiller technology and ice museum, also doing district heating. So as Caity mentioned, this is centralized heating and domestic hot water production for a district of buildings. And that heats all the buildings on the Chena property, which optimizes the cost of heating and the entire geothermal system and the efficiency and, you know, the use of the local resource. It then gets cascaded, and I might have this order a little bit wrong, but I think it then gets cascaded to the greenhouses and then finally to the pools that a lot of you have probably soaked in before. Next slide. So that was an example of a small scale combined heat and power project. Chena, last I checked, was about 680 kilowatts. So that's going to be, you know, probably the type of small scale combined heat and power plants that are available to Chena-like resources in the central Alaska Hot Springs belt. Switching gears and going down to the Aleutians volcanic belt, we've got a project in the works that would power Dutch Harbor. And this is, you know, related to the Mukushin volcano, which is about 14 miles from the Unalaska power grid. It's Alaska's best known high-grade geothermal resource. One of the few that have actually been drilled and proven. So there was some drilling in the 1980s that confirmed a resource capable of generating tens of megawatts or more of electricity. You know, the site has been really subject to a lot of detailed investigations carried out by state agencies, as well as universities, private companies. The project is, you know, a big logistical puzzle. It requires building out all needed infrastructure, including road, transmission, as well as drilling additional wells. But it is really exciting because it's, you know, it's moving forward under this new partnership between the Unalaska corporation, China Power, and a tribe with federal support. And so the project is now expected for 2027. And I put on some links for more info here. Next slide. Coming back to small scale project, the Kolker Geothermal project, which is also CHP, or Combined Heat and Power, just also was awarded some federal funding for a planned project about 60 miles from Nome. And this power plant would be kind of similar to China. It would be binary technology for a small scale power plant. And then it would cascade the heat to 18 tribal buildings, greenhouses, bathings, and other sort of economics development activities that would lead to jobs. And it's supported by ASAP and the Alaska Microgrid Group, as well as a federal source. I just show a picture here of what it looks like if you use a thermal infrared device and you fly over Pilgrim Hot Springs. And that was done in 2011 by the University of Alaska Fairbanks. This site does have historic usage, and that's what's shown in the photo above. Next slide. And then I think this is the last of the case studies, is Mount Spur Geothermal Project. So getting back to the rail belt grid, we are talking about the potential for a large scale, utility scale power production site. Mount Spur is often called the no-brainer for geothermal in Alaska. It's an active stratovolcano 80 miles from Anchorage, 40 miles from existing infrastructure and transmission. There are some indications of a hydrothermal resource at Mount Spur. I will say that not all volcanoes necessarily host a hydrothermal resource. So you do need to go and get out and explore each individual volcano or volcanic center before moving on to investing in developing a site. At Mount Spur, there's some warm seeps that actually issue from beneath a glacier. So that's pretty interesting. There are some logistical kind of risk issues at Mount Spur, which is basically that the warm seeps in the known kind of geothermal area is actually co-located with the area of volcanic hazards. And then, also the other thing is that it's a huge ice-covered glacial center, and everything becomes more difficult, not just for exploration, but also for development in that setting. Nonetheless, starting in 2008, the DNR sold 36,000 acres of leases. There was an exploration campaign carried out through 2011 that also got some support by the Alaska Renewable Energy Fund. And just last year, there were 3 new lease sales in different parts of the volcano. Next slide. Just a quick overview of the city of Seward's 2 different district heating projects that are powered by geothermal heat pumps. The one at the Alaska Sea Life Center, this audience might be very familiar with, so I won't talk about too much about that one. There's another one potentially kicking off here that would be serving the city of Seward for a district heating project for existing public buildings. So similar to the cartoon Katie showed earlier for Paris, this could be done for cities in Alaska. And if you want more info about those projects, I put on some links to news articles. Next slide. So what are some of the opportunities and the challenges for geothermal energy in Alaska? For me, the major opportunity is shown here in the worldwide geothermal power plant overview, which is the Ring of Fire, which englobes the North Pacific, in the entire Pacific. As you can see, has a lot of geothermal power plants all throughout the Ring of Fire, with this kind of notable gap in Alaska, but also Canada. Next slide. And, a lot of that has to do with the major challenges that face geothermal development worldwide, which has to do with the fact that there's a lot of high upfront risk, kind of related to what I was talking about earlier with resource risk, but also the fact that all of your risk happens early in the project when and that's when all of your cumulative costs are very high as well. So in that sense, it's kind of a similar risk structure to oil and gas, but the reward is significantly lower because geothermal heat and even power has a lower value and limited market right now. That might be changing, but it's kind of kept Alaska stuck in these kind of phase 1 and 2. The projects often get kind of stalled out in phases 1 and 2 in Alaska. Next slide. In Alaska, I see a particular opportunity for geothermal combined heat and power in remote communities for microgrids. And these, this is just a schematic we came up with in terms of how a geothermal combined heat and power plant could replace or complement existing diesel microgrids in rural villages. So, China is a good example. That's a resort, obviously, not a rural village, but it's, geothermal diesel tri-generation microgrid, which provides power, heat, and cooling, could really be something that could be replicated in remote communities and provide local jobs, food, and economic development opportunities. Next slide. There are some really exciting emerging things happening with in the world of geothermal technologies right now. And I wanted to point out one of them, which is lithium extraction or, general mineral extraction from geothermal brines. I'm a geologist, so I think a lot about how mines are basically fossil geothermal systems. And you really see that in some of these active geothermal fluids that have high concentrations of precious minerals in them. And I refer to a study NREL came out with last year on lithium extraction in general from geothermal. And then if you look at the map on the right, this comes out of Idaho National Lab, you can see that there's several geothermal sites which do have high lithium concentrations in their brines, and 2 of those are actually in Alaska. And Caity was referring with her cursor to a site that's currently under development in California in the Imperial Valley. So that's a opportunity that I think deserves a little more attention here in Alaska, considering the resources we have. Next slide. And just to sum up, why are we even considering geothermal in Alaska? Well, obviously, we have some really good resource potential, but that's not the only reason. The 3 types of geothermal technologies, so power production, direct use, and then geothermal heat pumps, make geothermal available almost anywhere in Alaska, excepting potentially, parts of the state that have permanent permafrost. So geothermal is a baseload renewable source of heat and sometimes power for urban and remote communities. And they do provide a lot of ancillary benefits that are often external to the market, things like energy, job, and food security, economic development, and community resilience. And so as 2 examples of resilience, we often look at Reykjavik, Iceland, which has a combined heat and power plant that serves the entire city. What I show here are reliability of those 2 different services, so electricity services and hot water services, annually. And you can see that the electricity in Reykjavik has been close to 100% reliable for the past 5 years, and the hot water also operates at really high reliability. Another example I give here is Whisper Valley Geogrid in Texas. This is a community that is powered by, it's an all renewable community that has geothermal heat pumps for heating and cooling and PV for electricity. And during the February 2021 snowstorm in Texas that knocked out the grid so notoriously, this particular community only lost power for a few hours and never lost to their homes. Next slide. So if you are interested in learning more about geothermal in your community, NREL is happy to help. Caity and I have put our email addresses here, and we're happy to take any questions in the time that remains. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Amanda and Caity, for those great presentations. We appreciate it. So I see a couple questions in the queue here. Caity and Amanda have answered a handful that you should be able to see. But yeah, please go ahead, use that Q&A feature to ask any questions. We got about 10 minutes left here, so I'll just kind of rattle through some of these for you guys and yeah, continue to ask away. So the first one is a question about Naknek. I think there was some geothermal exploration there. Do you guys have any insight or update on where that left off?
Take that one, Katie. Yeah, Naknek is an interesting kind of case study in how risky geothermal development can be. And so, you know, I'm not following recently what happened, but I know that basically they drilled an unsuccessful well that was at once an exploration and production well. So it ended up being really expensive. We didn't go into this too much, but about half of geothermal development costs are drilling costs. And that's why, and geothermal is a high capital cost technology. In fact, almost all the costs are capital. Then you don't have any fuel costs, O&M costs are very minimal throughout the lifetime of a project. So that's why I didn't go into it too much, but that's why it's really high risk right up front, right? And so, you know, as far as I know, you know, the Naknek well was expensive and did not hit the resource they were anticipating, which does happen. A lot of times you know, the project development proceeds in a way to, you know, mitigate that risk by doing really extensive surface exploration that's lower cost, and then moving into exploratory drilling, which is lower cost. For example, you know, on the Aleutians, there, some of the projects drilled slim holes, which are way cheaper. You can't produce them very well, but you haven't sunk, you know, as much money into a large diameter hole. So, you know, there's kind of, the geothermal industry has developed this whole kind of protocol for de-risking that part. But every once in a while, you know, it's that risk kind of ends up happening to investors. And in this case, I believe it was the utility that invested in it, if I'm not mistaken. So it's also a pretty high risk situation. Yeah, and I don't know what's happened recently.
Okay, thanks. Next question here is from Riley Newman. He asks, what opportunities are there for Alaskan companies to get involved with geothermal development? What kinds of services are needed?
So I'll start this and then Amanda can jump in. There's a lot of different opportunities for Alaskan companies to get involved in geothermal. You know, as discussed at the beginning, there are the 3 different types of geothermal resources. You know, the heat pumps, I think, are a great opportunity for Alaskan companies. There are very few companies within Alaska who are able to install or maintain these heat pump systems. So the systems aren't as widely deployed as they could be. However, if companies were able to, you know, go get some of that training, learn how to do that, I think it would really open the market up a lot. And then there's always the need for the various geological services, drilling services, et cetera, for the direct use and electricity production. Amanda, did I miss anything?
I think that was a good overview. Okay. Yeah, I guess one thing, I mean, I'm a geologist, so I might be biased, but I think there's also a lot of opportunity to better characterize our resources, which, you know, in the US often is a kind of public-private approach. I will say that, you know, I've worked abroad and even in other states in the US, a lot of the initial kind of prospecting part of geothermal resource characterization is more of a public effort. So, you know, I think Alaska should probably decide what kind of approach it wants to take, but we need better prospecting. Whether that happens through the private sector or the public sector, you know, I think is a strategic a discussion that should happen. But, you know, even if it was publicly funded, there would probably be still opportunities for, you know, engineering firms and geothermal consulting firms, geologic services, things like that, geotechnical, to do resource characterization at a sort of broad scale.
Great, thank you. Next question here from Kumar. Does Interior Alaska have potential for petrothermal energy power plant in the megawatt scale based on the heat maps you guys showed earlier?
That's a great question. I think, you definitely want to do a much more localized study because like I said, there's a lot of broad swaths of land there that are really extrapolations between points. But it's, I think that the petrothermal technologies are supposed to be able to be deployed everywhere. So if you have better thermal gradient, heat closer to the surface in Alaska than elsewhere, those technologies would only work better. It's really comes down to economics at this point, and better understanding what your local resources, where you drill.
Thanks.
But I will say, that I think, in my view, the low-hanging fruit in Alaska is hydrothermal right now, because that is mature, deployable commercial technology.
Well, that's a good segue to this next question from Martin. What technology advancements exist to ensure that drills hit the intended resource? Is LiDAR or anything like that being used?
Yeah, there is no technology that exists to ensure that the wells hit the resource. That's a major problem. There is technology you can use to target your wells in a favorable zone. So for example, like LiDAR is used, a lot of, different remote sensing technologies are used. There's geophysical surveys that you can do on the ground, like such as electromagnetic methods or gravity or just magnetic surveys to understand your heat flow and geology better. But none of them, 100% guarantee you're gonna hit a viable resource when you drill it.
But if someone were able to invent some X-ray glasses that could see down into the reservoir, that would definitely make you a lot of money and reduce some of that drilling risk.
Yeah, and one thing, maybe this gets back to the opportunities for Alaskans, because I think that there are some specific geologic conditions in Alaska that make exploration even harder, besides the fact that there's lots of trees, there's lots of glaciers. And one thing in particular is how really cold groundwater or even permafrost masks thermal signals from below. And so, I think universities and the private sector could be involved also in developing innovative exploration methods that would get around some of those technical barriers.
Great, thank you. That answers another question that was just asked as well. Andrew is also asking, is there anything that helps insulate small communities from expensive development and reliability risk associated with these explorations? This is sort of more on the policy side of things, but yeah, any response to that?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
He had asked, is there anything to help insulate the smaller communities that would like to develop geothermal, and reduce the risk basically in deploying this technology?
Good question. Katie, do you have any thoughts?
So here in the US, we don't have a lot of those financial de-risking mechanisms. There are some there's some mitigation funds and so forth in other countries that help with that. There's also some companies in Europe that are looking at drilling insurance for geothermal wells. It has not been widely adopted here in the US though. There are, some governmental programs through the Department of Energy, as well as other government agencies that can help to financially support some of the initial exploration, such as the ETIP program or the Communities LEAP program that are both run out of the Department of Energy. I know that the Alaskan Renewable Energy Fund has provided funding for geothermal projects in the past. I'm not sure if they are in the current cycle or not. But Yeah, unfortunately, the best recommendations that we have on that is to make sure for smaller communities you've really done your research and gathered all of that scientific data, as much of it as possible, so that you are scientifically narrowing down as much of the risk as possible before actually drilling a hole into the ground.
Great, thank you. Well, we are nearing the end of our hour here. I do realize there's a handful of questions here that we're not going to get to, but if you would really like to get something answered that didn't get answered, feel free to email me or Amanda and Katie. I'm sure they shared their email addresses, and I'll be sure to send those out in a follow-up email as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Amanda and Katie, for taking time and presenting today. And thank you to everybody for taking an hour on your lunch break here to hear about geothermal in Alaska. Yeah, keep an eye on your email for some follow-up and a link to sign up to our last session of the season on the Sustainable Southeast Partnership. So yeah, thanks, Amanda and Katie. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks. And I just did drop both Amanda and I's email in the chat if anyone wants to grab those and reach out to us.
Perfect. All right, take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.